This is Harbin, a thriving industrial city in northeast China. Because of its proximity to Russia, much of Harbin's culture and architecture has been influenced by the former Soviet Union. And Harbin is also known as Oriental Moscow or Little Moscow. Harbin, like many major Chinese cities, is growing and modernizing at a rapid pace, with construction sites all over the city. On the outskirts of Harbin, in a suburb called Pingfan, between the high-rises and factories, remains an open wound from the Japanese invasion of China. It was here that the Japanese military constructed a gigantic facility for the testing, production, and dissemination of biological warfare in the 1930s until the end of World War II. Officially, it was known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Corps. Informally, it was known as the Ishii Unit, after its director, the father of Japanese germ warfare, Shiro Ishii. In 1941, it was designated Unit 731, and it functioned as the headquarters of an intricate network of biological warfare laboratories throughout occupied China. Here in Pingfan alone, at least 3,000 human beings were killed in live body experiments from 1939 until 1945. Many thousands more were tested on and killed before Unit 731 was constructed in Pingfan, and in many other Japanese biological warfare facilities in China and Asia. Others were killed in field tests throughout China, and hundreds of thousands more perished in the ensuing plague, cholera, and germ outbreaks caused by Unit 731 and other units during the Japanese invasion and after they had surrendered. This was the site of the prison that housed up to 400 inmates at a time. Secret tunnels connected the prison to experimental laboratories, the administration building, human vivisection chambers, and the crematorium for corpses and body parts. This building was dedicated to frostbite experimentation. Winters were bitter cold in northern China, and frostbite had afflicted many Japanese soldiers in the invasion of Manchuria. Frostbite would also be a real hazard in the anticipated invasion of Russia. One method of study involved tying a human subject outdoors in the freezing below 0-degree winter, exposing his or her arms and hands, and pouring water over the limbs until they froze solid. Back inside the lab, scientists could test various schemes of thawing the frozen body parts with heat or warm water. Sometimes the limbs needed to be amputated, but others were left with dead limbs to study the effects of gangrene and blood poisoning, which would eventually kill them. Scientific curiosity led to other cruel experiments. Horse urine was injected into living people's kidneys. Horse blood plasma was tested as a substitute for human plasma. people were hanged upside down to see how long it took for a person to die. Some were choked to death to study asphyxiation. And some were confined to pressure chambers and made to endure increasingly high pressures until their intestines erupted from their bodies. Ironically, some victims were also exposed to lethal amounts of radiation, data which the Japanese would have far too much of in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Female prisoners were also abused and raped by Unit 731 workers. And the babies born of the crimes also became objects of study and were eventually vivisected. One Unit 731 employee testified that he was about to rape a frostbite experimentation victim. But once he saw that her sex organ was infected with gangrene, he changed his mind. Diseases and germs could be tested in any number of ways, but the best testing was on live people. Sometimes bacteria, for example, would be injected directly into a subject's bloodstream, or inmates would be forced to drink cholera-tainted milk or eat anthrax-laden food. Since the subjects were imprisoned, Japanese scientists could observe them as they slowly and painfully died, all the while recording physical and mental symptoms, and then dissect the inmates before they actually expired, to methodically observe the diseases and germs as they continued to destroy the prisoners' internal organs. Bacteria were then harvested from the inmates' organs to generate stronger, deadlier strains, which could be weaponized and used to poison the enemy's wells, food supplies, and territory. Once diseases were perfected and optimized for killing as many people as possible, Unit 731 scientists devised numerous ways of delivering them to unsuspecting populations. Rats were caught, bred, and infected with plague to feed millions of deadly fleas that could infect people and livestock with their bites. Here is where the rats were bred. A traditional bomb carrying fleas was inefficient, since the bomb's impact and heat would kill too many disease-carrying fleas. Unit 731 scientists discovered that bombs made of ceramic could be dropped from planes on cities and towns. And not only would many of the fleas survive, the ceramic bomb itself would decay and be difficult to trace back to the Japanese military. Once Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, it was ordered that all evidence of Japanese biological and chemical warfare activity be destroyed. All surviving Unit 731 inmates were killed and their bodies burned. Since the complex was so large, it was difficult to completely demolish. Biological warfare units throughout China blew up their facilities, buried and destroyed their stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons, and destroyed their research, though not all of it. Shiro Ishii and other Unit 731 scientists safely returned to Japan and began negotiating with the American occupation forces. In exchange for their research data, the American government shielded Unit 731 scientists from the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. It even employed some in the US's own biological warfare program and provided gifts and money to others. individual victims have been suing the Japanese government for a number of years. So far, all the cases have lost in court. The Japanese government has never acknowledged Unit 731's existence, and the great majority of Japanese history textbooks don't even mention Japan's biological warfare program. In a 2002 lawsuit brought by Chinese victims' family members, a Japanese court did rule that Japan was responsible for murder. But compensation and an apology were denied. So far, an estimated 500,000 disease deaths, directly or indirectly caused by Japan's biological warfare, remain uncompensated. In Japan, human remains have been found buried near former secret research facilities with connections to Unit 731. The bones bore the marks of violence, such as bullet holes and surgical experimentation. For half a century, all of Unit 731's human experimentation data was sealed and protected by the United States government. In China, the legacy of Unit 731 and other Japanese biological warfare units lives on. Construction workers continue to unearth buried caches of Japanese chemical weapons, and occasionally, some workers are killed. In so-called rotten leg villages, some biological warfare victims, who were children during Japan's invasion, continue to suffer from open glanders and anthrax wounds that just won't heal. Unit 731 hasn't healed either. This is Harbin, a thriving industrial city in northeast China, otherwise known as Manchuria. Harbin is close to both Russia and North Korea. Japan assisted Korea in its first efforts to modernize and to free itself from its ancient and unequal relationship with China. Since Russia was a growing threat, it was important to Japan's national security that Korea become an impregnable fortress. Japan had fought China over Korea before, but in 1894, Japan emerged victorious because of its modernized military and the awareness on the part of the Japanese that they were now one people, unlike China in the late 19th century. Boasting a national budget and military strength 10 times larger than Japan's, Russia had reinforced its troops in Manchuria and began construction on a military base in Korea. It was clear that if Japan stood by idly, the Russian military presence in East Asia would grow so powerful that Russia would have a clear competitive edge over Japan. the Japanese government decided to attack Russia first in a preemptive strike. Russia lost, and Russian influence faded in Harbin. After World War I, the Russian Revolution changed Russia into the Soviet Union, and it became even more threatening to the rest of the world. Although the Soviet Union claimed to be striving for an ideal classless society, its main products were labor camps and countless executions. As efforts to unite China progressed, and as a result of the unequal treaties, attempts to expel foreign nationals gained momentum. An anti-Japanese movement arose. Japanese goods were boycotted, and Japanese citizens attacked. There were already more than 200,000 Japanese settlers in Manchuria, and a Japanese military force, the Kanto Army, was assigned to protect them. To further ensure the safety of its citizens, the Japanese military created the state of Manchuria and installed the last Qing dynasty emperor, Pu Yi, as the Emperor of Manchuria. The Oscar-winning film, The Last Emperor, is based on him. China was in the midst of civil war between the larger nationalist government and the growing communist forces, which were supported by the Soviet Union. Tensions escalated between the Japanese military and the Chinese, and attacks on Japanese soldiers started Japan's war with China. Some criminals were imprisoned and executed by the Japanese military. Many of them were communists, spies, or saboteurs, and they were sentenced to death in a time of war. Whatever sacrifices were made to contribute to the benefit of humankind. War and atrocities go hand in hand. During war, soldiers from all involved nations engaged in rape, looting, and murder. It was rumored that Chinese killed and ate Japanese soldiers. American soldiers routinely raped Japanese women, including young girls. And American GIs even collected Japanese skulls and kept them as souvenirs. Japanese soldiers experienced unimaginable suffering and privation. And later, with the indiscriminate firebombing of major Japanese cities, tens of thousands of civilians were burned to death or left homeless by American B-29s. On March 10, 1945, Tokyo was the target of a massive firebombing attack which killed 100,000 people in one night. The infamous August 1945 nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki left over 200,000 people dead from the explosion and its aftermath. Western nations had been slicing up and colonizing China since the First Opium War in the early 19th century. Japan had been attempting to rid Asia of Western imperialism, and it even inspired many other colonized nations, such as India and Vietnam, to break the yoke of Western domination. The Chinese were implementing brainwashing techniques long before they invented the term. Many Japanese soldiers were detained by the Communist Chinese government after Japan surrendered. And during their incarceration, they were brainwashed into believing concocted and false stories about Japan's war with China. Nothing that any Japanese POW says or has said can be trusted as the truth. The ruling Chinese Communist Party is itself guilty of killing millions of people. We only need to remember the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, the Tiananmen Massacre, etc. After the Chinese judge themselves, they can judge Japan. They should clean their own house before they focus on others. Japan has apologized for the war on many occasions and paid compensation to numerous countries. The 1951 Treaty of San Francisco settled any claims for war reparations. After Japan surrendered, Chiang Kai-shek of the Chinese Nationalist government also abandoned any claims for war reparations. The issue of reparations, compensation, and apologies has been settled. China is still a one-party communist state with no freedom of speech, religion, or assembly. Sites and so-called memorials have arisen all over China, but much of what is purported to be the truth is false, politicized, and reconstructed. Sites such as this one are deliberately constructed and promoted by the Chinese Communist Party. Surrounding it all are new buildings and factories, and yet this area is left alone. Why? Where is the evidence? Where are the bodies, the bones, the skeletons? Ruins in and of themselves do not prove anything. And what changes have been made to a supposedly original site? How do we know the signs are true? The Soviets and Chinese are well known to have altered photographs, films, and history itself to promote their own ends. If extraordinary evidence of so-called Japanese biological war crimes exists, then the United States government has it. There are no available records of facilities such as Unit 731 in Japan. And almost all Japanese wartime records were carried to the United States after the war. No records are available for study on the matter, and in fact, many of the books or studies that have appeared in the US or China have either been fabrications or based on communist Chinese lies.